Good afternoon, Luang Por.
Good afternoon, Ajahn Sumedho.
So today is April 18, 2022. And thank you once again for taking some time for a little question and answer session. Today, I'd like to bring up the topic of fear in the practice. It's not uncommon with meditation that stuff comes up in the mind. Sometimes on retreat, when people are taking personal retreats and have more time with themselves, and things arise, or otherwise just generally in the practice as we start studying the mind. It seems like sometimes things arise that are maybe difficult to process and that we fear might overwhelm us. Could you say a few words about that, please?
Well, fear is a kind of primal emotion that we all have. There's a lot to fear as a physical body. Living in the world and all kinds of unknown factors affecting you. And then, so we tend to see it in a very personal way. Like the idea of being fearless is a great ideal, to be a man without fear. But when we learn to notice fear rather than just react to it, as long as fear can make us frightened, fearful things can make us frightened, or even the psychological fears can scare us, frighten us. How do we know what's deep down inside us in the dark places, the dark shadow of life? And these kind of questions arise in many of us in our meditative experiences, because so much of life is, modern life is about being fearless and distracting yourself when anything frightening comes, to run away from it or suppress it. There's a natural fear, like when a tiger's chasing you, that's survival. But so much of neurotic fear is just psychological that we create because we don't know what's inside us. We hear all kinds of stories about ghosts or spirits or evil forces, satanic forces. These are all frightening perceptions. And so when we start meditating, as we gain a level of calm, and if we're not going to distract ourselves in any immediate way, then all these repressed fears can come into consciousness, which is seen as a very, terrifying experience for many monks or nuns who have long periods of silence and silent meditation. When these dark forces start manifesting in consciousness, how do we relate to them? What are they anyway? And because we take everything personally, we see them as some kind of personal problem, mental disorders. We can just say that, it's all superstition, we can dismiss it. We can, in the world of sensual experience, we use our sensual pleasures to escape the fear of existence, of death. Death is the ultimate fear, because you don't know what's going to happen. because our whole conscious experience is limited by the forms that we identify with. So we bind ourselves to the forms that we want stabilized and security from, and such as we want to be happy and have good health and success and prosperity and be free from fear. These are what everybody, most of us want as individual human beings. But in terms of Dhamma, of the way things are, fear is part of the experience of being human, and it's not personal. We begin to, if we take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, or in some kind of sense of safety or ultimate goodness, morality, generosity, and in this tradition in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, that always gave me the kind of strength to face up to the repressed fears of my life. Because on an intellectual level, just that idea of taking refuge in the Dhamma is it's like faith in God or some kind of perfect state or being in the universe that's protective and loves you. That can be a kind of sense of personal safety in which we can face the fears that arise from what we've repressed: dread, fear, resentment, anger, jealousy. So in this way of the witnessing fear, rather than trying to suppress it or get rid of it, or just attach to it, when we become frightened and we just react to it by running away or doing something to repress it or get away from it, then fear has increasingly more power over our lives. And like repressing fear is empowering fear. So fear is like one of these Chinese paper dragons. When you see it and it manifesting in front of you, it's frightening. But if you don't run away from it, it's harmless. It's just made out of paper and air. So this is a way to reflect on fear, is to use it. You see it as something to learn from, rather than as some kind of personal defect.
One of the emotions that I hear sometimes people talk about as being afraid of is anger. There might be a lot of repressed anger that starts coming up and they're afraid of letting it out. Do you address the fear, or you kind of open up to the anger in this case?
Well, anger is primal emotion. There's a lot to be angry about as an individual, because life isn't going to be fair and just and loving and kind from the personal aspect. As a person, we suffer. And in one's experience, as children, there's a lot to fear when you go out and start going to school. The bullies, the competition, the jealousies arise, and it's the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest. And we learn how to survive in situations in various ways that can be, usually by suppressing or we blame the bullies for our suffering, or because we feel we weren't treated fairly, we can, even though we may have been unfairly treated, it's the memory of being unfairly treated that is the suffering, because it's personal. I should have been treated fairly. It's my right to be respected and treated fairly and justly with loving kindness is oftentimes how we think about life. But life is like this. You don't choose your parents. You're born into a family. You don't know what they're like, or how mature or wise or fair or just or kind or loving they're going to be. But we learn how to survive, even with parents that are cruel and selfish and unfair to us, because survival is part of our primal conditioning. So anger, because on the idea level, anger is a spiritual seeker or wanting to be a good person, and then we tend to suppress anger, afraid of it, afraid of exploding, of losing our temper, of making a scene, of humiliating ourselves, or committing a violent act through anger. So, and these are all possibilities for any of us. But the witnessing position is, anger is an impermanent condition and it's not personal. When you want to get rid of it, that's a person. That's a personal desire to get rid of something you don't want. And so, rather than trying to get rid of it, annihilate it, destroy it, you learn from it, you investigate it, you study it. Understand anger is like this. Even if it's just angry over petty little details of life, just being annoyed or resentful in small ways can be, we can easily be upset when we feel insulted by somebody. And then we can say, well, it doesn't really matter, that person doesn't know what they're talking about, they don't understand. Maybe we can justify it on the intellectual level, but anger is a very psychic experience. It's all mental, it's emotional, it's not reasonable, it's not rational, it's like this. So our emotions are to be understood because they are impermanent. And they're not self, they're not what I am. I'm not an angry person, even though anger arises. If I see myself as an angry person, then I tend to reestablish that perception throughout my life. But once I take the witness position, then anger is not personal, it is what it is. And if you're patient and allow it to be what it is, even welcome it, then but don't act on it or speak on it, just be the witness, watch it. It arises, anything that arises ceases, and when we begin to notice, have insight into the cessation of anger, then that's the path that we cultivate. The path of non-anger. It doesn't mean we never feel angry, because it's a part of this realm, this sensual feeling realm. This is not an ideal realm as we would like it to be. It's about feeling, about aging, about disease, about birth and death. These are the experiences that we have through these bodies, these forms that we tend to identify with. But when we see the form is a condition that arises and ceases, so we ask ourselves, what happens when we die? Because death can be a very frightening perception. When somebody dies, we feel this sense of sadness, of grief, depending on the person. Like the news of the day about all these Ukrainians and Russian soldiers dying in this kind of war that's taking place there, and you're naturally going to feel a kind of sadness that these individual beings, men, women, children, military, civilians, whatever their status may be, it's the body that dies. So when we take refuge in the witness, in our ability, sati, sampajanya, or mindfulness, or awareness, then we're aware of death before the body dies. Because we're experiencing death all the time, the ending of a condition. So Luang Por Chah always encouraged me to really notice the ending of a condition. It's easy to see the beginning, but so much of our life is never noticing the ending of anything. So, a life can be just an experience of trying to be reborn endlessly with interesting things, or eating, overeating, smoking, drinking, drugs. All these are attempts at rebirth, being born again into some kind of pleasant or acceptable mental state where old age, sickness, death, these are, how many old people really contemplate age? Aging is like this, rather than seeing, that operating from the illusion that I am an old body. Then we have various reasons. I'm going to die in a few years, and what happens when Ajahn Sumedho dies? And this is a question people ask me: what happened when Luang Por Chah died? What happened when the Buddha died? And so the death is always a question mark, because we identify death with merely the experience of physical death, rather than the continuous death of a condition, which is going on all the time. So while we're still conscious forms, with these five khandhas, these bodies, these feelings, these memories, emotions, sensory conscious experiences, these are all subject to change in the present experience of life. What begins ends. So it's learning in the monastic life, as you probably are well aware of, Ajahn Sumedho, so much of monastic life is really boring, because the opportunities to distract yourself through sensory indulgence are much more limited. And so boredom, impatience, restlessness, these kind of emotional experiences, we take the time, we have a lifestyle and encouragement to kind of witness these states: boredom, restlessness, mental restlessness, physical restlessness, disease, old age. So we're not trying to find a cure for old age and find the fountain of youth before we die, but we're actually abiding in the deathless reality of awareness, which doesn't die, that isn't born, because conscious awareness isn't something that has a beginning and an ending. It doesn't die. But all that we identify with out of ignorance, the body will die, our emotions die, they disappear. You can kill them off by suppressing them, and then the rebirth of those emotions is strengthened. So just like suppressing anger or fear, you're not really witnessing its absence. It's because every condition dies in awareness, in conscious awareness, in the deathless. And if we have that kind of willingness to bear with the boredom, restlessness, and the fears, angers, jealousies, resentments that arise, they all take us to nirodha, to the end of suffering, which we realize before the body dies. So we call this enlightenment. It's this awakening to the way things are that is the definition of enlightenment, to see things as they are. But you can't see things as they are as long as the illusion of a separate self is your modus operandi. You need to change that, beginning to investigate. Are you really a physical form? Is this really what I am, this body? And by investigating, just asking this question, you start changing from just taking for granted that you are, because that's the ignorance. One's ignorant. One just assumes that one is the physical body, being male or female, black or white, young or old. We assume these are self. And so any, like political correctness of this modern age is all about not offending the illusory self, rather than pointing to the reality that all living beings are not their bodies. And the bodies, we have different forms. So we're the human form, and then we notice the cat, the feline, the dog, the cow, the bull, the cuckoo, the blackbirds, forms that are different, but they're conscious in consciousness the same as we are. So is consciousness in, the illusion that most of us had from the early conditioning of our lives, is that consciousness is inside the form. The form is conscious, the body is conscious, this body is a conscious form. And that makes me feel, when I see that, when I always come from this sense of consciousness is inside me, it becomes very personal. It's my consciousness. And I don't know what's going on in your consciousness, or in the consciousness of the cat or the dog. Or we can, I've heard people, scientists, psychologists even say animals are not conscious, which sounds totally ridiculous, because they obviously are conscious, in consciousness, rather than a dog consciousness, a cat consciousness, a human consciousness. Consciousness has no form. It's formless. But it's what we are, what we're experiencing here and now, continuously.
So in terms of these emotions, how do you, when the reflex of what arises in the practice can be during meditation, a retreat, or just in the course of life, circumstances give rise to emotions, and the very strong reflex is to either get carried away with it or to try to get rid of it. How do you navigate that in order to come back to the consciousness where you can allow it into consciousness without following the emotion or trying to get rid of it?
Well, just changing your attitude of trying to get rid of it. Because that's the natural reaction. Something painful, something unpleasant, something frightening, something we don't want, we want to get rid of it. Don't tell me the truth, tell me what I'd like to hear. Is everything okay? Yes, Ajahn Sumedho, everything is okay. That's what Ajahn Sumedho likes to hear. But then in terms of daily life, everything isn't okay. One wants to be happy, find happiness in this life, samana life that we live. And so we find living in a community that we don't have personal choices about. We have to live with these various characters with their idiosyncrasies and peculiarities that we may not understand at all. So we can blame our suffering on the fact that there's too many oddballs, too many weirdos. We got to get rid of all them and just have people that don't seem weird or abnormal to live with is a program that we might spend our lives trying to promote in our lives and find it hopeless. Because the world isn't going to, you can't, just trying to, I've known monks who spent their monastic life always running away from stressful situations in monasteries. Say they can't meditate. So because of this, there's this person they don't like, or they don't like the Ajahn, or on and on like that. So this is still very personal, isn't it? When I don't like somebody, that's personal. But being aware of not liking somebody is impersonal. So what is your real refuge in the impersonal awareness of the feeling I don't like somebody is like this. And this is a way of changing from just being helplessly caught in the momentum of one's habits, one's conditioning, into learning to understand the causes of suffering. So it's learning to embrace life, to learn from it. How can we, we're individuals on the conditioned level. On the conscious level, we're the same, we're one, complete. So consciousness is universal, it's unitive. It's not divisive. But what divides is our thinking habits, our identity with conditions, with our emotions, with our memories, with our physical appearance. All these make me feel separate from you. And so then, if I operate from, I'm a completely separate person from you, that's the social conventions I was conditioned by, but is that really the way it is? What do we share with all creation, all conditions, is consciousness. Consciousness is unitive. It's you can call it unconditioned love. You want to put it in more positive terms? Completeness or perfection, wholeness. So sometimes I refer to individuals, I tell them, you're perfect, and they don't know how to relate to that. They get embarrassed, or they go back and, I've got all kinds of faults and problems, emotional difficulties, and I haven't led a very pure life. I've got past that I feel guilty about, and we go endlessly on and on into creating this separate self, this personality that is always, which is an illusion. It's not really what anyone is. It has how things manifest and change, but whatever manifests ceases. And as Shakespeare, quoting from one of Shakespeare's sonnets, death once dead, there's no more dying then. So, when we study death, investigate death in daily life, I spent months, years, just dedicating myself to the ending of a thought or a condition or emotion. Just reminding myself to pay attention to the absence. And that's where I began to notice this vibration, sound of silence. When I let everything cease, I didn't cease being conscious. There was this silence. And, that's the end of suffering. Everything ends in silence. All conditions that arise, that manifest, they end, they cease. And is this silence consciousness? Or is it awareness? There's so many teachers now talking about awareness, consciousness, or prior to consciousness, or, so we have various words that try to invoke the sense of absolute silence where there's no suffering, but there's still consciousness. But we're not attached to consciousness. We don't, when we attach to senses, experience of sense consciousness, then we get attached to the flowers or the kuti we're living in or the people we like, and so but the senses are very impermanent. Like right now, looking at you across the room, you're very hazy. My vision, far-away vision is very foggy. So for me to see your face properly, your features, in front, you have to come up close. So when I was young, I had 20/20 vision. I could have been an airplane pilot. But now I don't. They wouldn't accept me. So the senses, the senses are impermanent. The eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, all these are subject to other conditions. We can go blind when we're young, lose our sense of smell, deaf to sound. These aren't just old age problems. Our bodies can be disabled when we're young. So we can lose limbs, we can be born disabled in deformed bodies and things like this. But the consciousness is absolutely pure. So that's another concept, purity. Can the worldly conditions that are constantly changing be really permanently pure? No, their nature is to change. They reach maybe peak moments where everything is at their best, where it's what we imagine we would like to have all the time. But then the weather changes, people change, conditions change, governments change, everything's changing. So the Buddha, one of his basic teaching was to contemplate impermanence. Because that which is permanent can see impermanence, can notice it. It's like this. Just how long can you sustain a thought? Just like the sense of I am. How long can you, when you contemplate the thinking process, the English pronoun for the personal is I. It's only one letter, and it appears, it manifests and disappears almost immediately after you've thought it. So what is left when the I disappears is silence, the unborn, uncreated, unformed, unconditioned. But then we're conditioned to think in grammatical patterns that we learn from our parents, from our teachers. So I am Ajahn Sumedho, that's a convention. Nothing wrong with it, but they are conventions, they are impermanent, unsatisfactory conventions, words, perceptions. And so language is, moves very quickly. When we live in a world of just thinking, then our lives are constantly caught up into thinking, habits of thinking, worrying, anxiety, fears, the future, the past, guilt, remorse, resentment. So we create these emotions not out of choice, but out of habit. We're the creatures of habit. Just noticing, in my own experience, how the thinking habit that I've developed is like this. And but that which is aware of thought is not a thought.
That applies to emotions the same way, doesn't it?
Same with emotions. Emotions are, this is a feeling realm. It's an emotional experience being born in these forms. Fear is sexual desire, procreating the species. Fear, confusion, these are our anger, they're part of the human experience that we're experiencing through these forms. But are we the form? And this is a question one should ask oneself. Are we the forms that experience life? And as we begin to investigate that, we begin to lose that attitude, taking for granted that I am the form and this personality, because there's awareness of the personality, awareness of the emotion, awareness of the body. So can the body be aware of consciousness? Can the emotions be aware of consciousness? Or is the awareness of consciousness how it works? Being frightened is like this. Awareness is non-judgmental. It doesn't discriminate or divide anything. It just knows the way things are. All that is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. And Dhamma, perfection, ultimate, absolute, supreme reality, whatever name you want to give it, is what we are. Because this is, when we take refuge in awareness, conscious awareness, we're giving up our identities with the separateness, with the changing forms. We're not getting rid of them. We're not judging them anymore. But we're the witness that all conditions are impermanent, because that's the way it is. That's not the belief. That you can actually witness and know for yourself. If you take the time, you have the willingness and the trust to be mindful of the way things are.
Thank you very much, Luang.